it already exists, then what would be her objection, or anyone's objection, to merely adopting a measure that says any such mandate, if and when it's issued, must contain such an exemption, an objection that my friend and colleague from Washington assures us already exists? It's difficult for me to understand how this would be objectionable. Without these protections, you see, President Biden is telling many religious minorities in the country that they need not apply for a job. And if they've got a job already, that job is in jeopardy. Freedom to make one's own medical decisions is fundamental to our system of liberty. The economic impact of the mandates is going to hamper our economic recovery as workers are forced to make hard decisions. Here, we're talking specifically about objections rooted in religious or other sincerely held personal beliefs. If, in fact, that exemption already exists, that protection is already there, which it isn't, because it can't be, because the document itself doesn't exist, then why not embrace it? Why not accept it? Why not acknowledge it in law? I struggle to imagine what harm could come from protecting religious minorities in this country. And I'd find it very discouraging, very distressing, that this body, the United States Senate, wouldn't want to do everything we possibly could to make that happen. Another word about the fact that it doesn't yet exist. The mandate isn't there. Because it's not there, employers with more than 99 employees around the country are being forced to guess as to what it might mean, and a whole lot of them are already preparing their own policies, in some cases already adopting them and enforcing them based on their own anticipation of what the mandate might be. What this means as a practical matter is that you can't sue anyone. You can't sue any administrator in the Biden administration or elsewhere in the federal government who's going to be enforcing this, because you don't know what they're going to be enforcing. There isn't a dispute ripe for adjudication in any court anywhere because we don't know what that is. For many people, this entire exercise could be rendered moot in the meantime. Not just moot in the sense that the court would lack Article III jurisdiction to entertain the dispute in question, but moot in the sense that they might lose their job. Moot in the sense that they are going to have to face this awful Hobson's choice between maintaining their ability to provide for their family, on the one hand, and on the other hand, receiving a medical procedure that they would deem harmful and objectionable based on their religious or other sincerely held beliefs. This, Mr. President, is not American. This, Mr. President, is not acceptable. And this, Mr. President, is not and cannot possibly be constitutional. We should be able to do this. I'm going to be back tomorrow, the next day, and as long as it takes to keep addressing this issue. Freedom matters, and the Constitution matters. President Biden has ignored them both. Thank you, Mr. President.
The question is on the nomination.
The question is on the nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Mr. Rono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse.
Okay.
Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Brown, Burr, Carper, Cortez Masto, Crapo, Heinrich, Inhofe, Klobuchar, Markey, Murphy, Murray, Schatz, Smith, Tillis, Van Hollen, Warner. Senators voting in the negative: Blackburn, Fisher, Haggerty, Lee, Sass, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Kramer, no. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Padilla, aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Bozeman, no.
You're not going?
Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. King, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Tuberville, no. Mrs. Hyde Smith, no. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Romney, aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. Ms. Lummis, no. Mr. Lujan, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Shelby, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Johnson, no. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Ms. Ernst, no. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. Toomey, no. Mrs. Capito, aye. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Cotton, no. Mr. Rono, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Carden, aye. Mr. Barrasso, no. Miss Cinema, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Marshall, no.
Cut them by 15% for the banks that are 250 billion.
Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. Coons, aye.
That's how the pieces work.
Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Daines, no. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Hawley, no. Mr. Warnock, aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, no. Mr. Hoven, no.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Blunt, aye.
We're ready? The yeas are 67, the nays are 31. The nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified of the Senate action. The clerk will report the next nomination.
Nomination, Department of State, Todd D. Robinson of New Jersey to be an Assistant Secretary, International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs.
Mr. President. Senator from New Jersey.
Mr. President, we heard over the course of many hours last week, and indeed over the many months, that foreign affairs nominees have been languishing on the Senate floor. The concerns of the junior senator from Texas related to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. We also have heard at length from members of this body about the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan, the junior senator from Missouri. As I have said publicly and repeatedly, I share my colleague's concerns about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. He put up a series of my quotes. They're all true. I'm still of that view. But I'm not of the view that you stop the national security apparatus in order to pursue a policy difference and create a whole host of other serious risks for the United States. I believe and have said that the evacuation from Afghanistan was fatally flawed. In fact, the Foreign Relations Committee held a hearing and heard from Secretary Blinken about the situation in Afghanistan. The Foreign Relations Committee is holding a briefing tomorrow about the administration's efforts to bolster European energy security to counter Russia's efforts in this area. And I intend to continue oversight of the situation in Afghanistan and why, over the course of 20 years, we failed. What I fail to understand is the relationship between the foreign affairs nominees pending before this body and those topics. These individuals are critical to confronting numerous other global challenges, promoting American values, and advancing the safety, health, and economic well-being of Americans. We need them confirmed today. I therefore will rise to seek unanimous consent for the confirmation of 10 nominees, including 7 career diplomats. Each of them moved to the Foreign Relations Committee with bipartisan support. There's no reason for Republicans to block their confirmation. Let me speak to them for a minute or two. This is especially the case at the U.S. Agency for International Development. The administrator of USAID, Samantha Power, is the only member of that agency's senior leadership that has been confirmed by this body. Ambassador Power needs her senior leadership team in place, yet her 2 deputies are languishing on the floor because of Republican holds. This agency is grappling with the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and other humanitarian emergencies that are ravaging the globe. It simply cannot function at its best without senior leadership. So why is it that Republicans insist on blocking Paloma Adams-Allen and Isabel Coleman, 2 highly qualified nominees to serve as USAID's deputy administrators? Let me take a moment to once again raise Haiti. We heard a lot about Haiti here on the floor, particularly from our Republican colleagues and the challenge at the border. Well, in August, a massive earthquake in Haiti killed more than 2,200 people, injured 12,000 more, destroyed tens of thousands of buildings. This comes after the assassination of Haiti's president. But here again, Republicans are holding a senior member of Ambassador Power's team, Marcela Escobar, the nominee to be the Assistant Administrator for Latin America and the Caribbean at USAID. Escobar, who will manage our response to the Haiti earthquake, once confirmed, already held this very job in the Obama administration. And guess what? She was confirmed by voice vote then. Now, we want to deal with the challenge of Haitian refugees coming to the border and other refugees in the hemisphere coming in to the border, let's confirm the USAID Deputy Administrator who will deal with that issue so we can deal with the root causes. How do we create stability in Haiti? How do we provide relief for the Haitian people? How do we create feeding for the Haitian people so they're not fleeing their country? But no, we're going to stop this nominee who is going to be at the very heart of that. So when you see a new group of Haitian refugees, blame yourself. We spent many months in this body talking about the challenges posed by the government of the People's Republic of China. The U.S. Innovation and Competition Act passed by this body in June, and the Strategic Competition Act, which passed almost unanimously out of the Foreign Relations Committee 21-1, are proof of that. We have collectively come together on this much, recognized China as the greatest geopolitical and geoeconomic challenge for United States foreign policy, and we have rightly focused on effectively confronting Chinese malign influence. And yet, we are failing to ensure a fundamentally critical element of that strategy. That is empowered leadership in our diplomatic corps across the world. Our former colleague, Senator Ken Salazar, is the only, hear me, the only Biden administration nominee who's been confirmed to serve as a country ambassador representing U.S. interests abroad. The only one in the 9th month of this administration. Let me be clear. Holding up diplomats is effectively ceding influence to China and actively undermining U.S. national security interests. People come to the floor and talk about China. Well, they're empowering China by not having our people in position to counter their influence. It's a fact that Congo and Angola owe over 40% of their entire national debt to whom? To China. So I ask my colleagues, why have we not yet confirmed Tulanebo Moshinji, a career foreign service officer, as our ambassador to Angola? Why have we not yet confirmed Eugene Young, another career foreign service officer, as our ambassador to the Congo? China and Somalia have recently entered into a new fishing agreement, and Chinese vessels are increasingly accessing Somalia's waters and strategic coastline adjacent to the Red Sea. Why have we not confirmed Larry Andre Jr., a career foreign service officer, as our ambassador to Somalia? China's influence is spread across the continent of Africa, including through its Belt and Road Initiative, which is branded as a development initiative but being used by China to advance its own interests. Why have we not yet confirmed Elizabeth Albin and Maria Brewer, two career foreign service officers, as our ambassadors to Algeria and Lesotho, respectively? I've spoken on the Senate floor several months ago about Chinese influence in Cameroon. We have not had an American ambassador in Cameroon in over a year. Why have we not yet confirmed Christopher John Lamora, a career foreign service officer, as our ambassador to Cameroon? Vietnam sits on the border of China. It's on the front lines of Chinese coercion in the South China Sea. Why have we not yet confirmed Mark Napper, a career foreign service officer, as our ambassador to Vietnam? Colleagues, each of these nominees I mentioned deserves to be confirmed today, and our national security interests demand it. So in pursuit of what I hope will be a recognition of that, because at some point something's going to happen here in the world, in one of these countries or one of these regions. And when it happens, and we didn't have our representative there, I think a member who is objecting is going to have to live with that reality. So let me ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to consider the following nomination. Executive Calendar number 336, Paloma Adams Allen, to be a Deputy Administrator of the United States Agency for International Development, that the nomination be confirmed, the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, that no further motions be made, be in order, I should say, in terms of the nominations, that the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action, the Senate then resume legislative session.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Missouri.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object. I appreciate the earnestness on this issue from my friend and colleague, the Senator from New Jersey. He mentions about something could happen in the world, something will happen in the world, something I submit to you has happened in the world, and today we've been learning about it. I'm talking about the crisis in Afghanistan, the debacle in Afghanistan. All day the Senate has been hearing testimony in the Armed Services Committee from Secretary Austin, from General Milley, from General McKenzie, about how it came to be that 13 American service members are dead, 169 civilians killed, hundreds of Americans left behind enemy lines there as we still speak. The greatest foreign policy crisis that this country has seen since Vietnam, and those aren't my words, those are the words, the comparison of the members, the Democrat members of the committee, who repeatedly referenced today Vietnam, the fall of Saigon. That's the level of crisis that we're dealing with. And what accountability has there been for this crisis, Mr. President, for this debacle? Because crisis isn't even quite the right word. That sounds like it's a natural disaster, like it just accidentally happened. That's not the case. No, this is a debacle. This is a failure of leadership of the first order. And what accountability has there been for it? Who has resigned? Who has been fired? Who has been relieved of command? Nobody. What actions has the administration taken? None. What did Secretary Austin say today? He said, well, we'll take a hard look at ourselves and we'll ask some tough questions. Well, Mr. President, that is not nearly good enough. Americans are dead. Americans are stranded behind enemy lines. Our foreign policy is in a state of collapse. Our national security is in a state of collapse. Enemies around the world are watching what's happened in Afghanistan and are seeing an opportunity. As the United States shows weakness and disarray and chaos, there must be accountability. Let me say something more about what we learned today, because we did learn quite a lot, and all of it is frightening. We learned that the President of the United States lied. He lied when he said to the American people in an interview on television just a few weeks ago that he was never told by any of his military advisors, never told that a drawdown on this timetable, his timetable, would result in catastrophe. He was asked by George Stephanopoulos, and now I'm quoting, but your top military advisors warned against withdrawing on this timetable. They wanted you to keep about 2,500 troops. President Biden, no, they didn't. Stephanopoulos, they didn't tell you that they wanted troops to stay? President Biden, no. Stephanopoulos, so no one told you, your military advisors did not tell you, no, we should just keep 2,500 troops? President Biden, no. No one said that to me that I can recall. Today we heard from General Milley and General McKenzie and Secretary Austin, who each of them said that they advised the President. It was their considered military judgment that the President's plans were mistaken. They advised against it. They advised him against it. And yet he said, no, no one ever told me. I'm not responsible. No one ever told me. We also learned this. We learned that the President lied when he said that he had no idea that the Taliban would take over the country in such a short time period. From the same interview, George Stephanopoulos said back in July, this is to President Biden, back in July, you said a Taliban takeover was highly unlikely. Was the intelligence wrong, or did you downplay it? Biden said, no, I think that there was no consensus. If you go back and look, they said that this is not going to happen. Stephanopoulos, you didn't put a timeline on it when you said it was highly unlikely. You just flat out said it's highly unlikely the Taliban would take over. Biden says, yeah. But we learned today that, in fact, his commander on the ground, General Miller, warned as early as March of this year that the military situation in Afghanistan was deteriorating rapidly, that the Taliban was on the offensive, that the drawdown of American troops would likely result in the collapse of the Afghan government and the Afghan security forces sooner rather than later. It was going to come fast, is what General Miller said. And yet, the president says no one ever told him that. He never knew about it. In fact, his own commanders on the ground warned him about it. And what was the consequence of this? Well, the president is either forgetting or ignoring or just outright lying about what he was advised by his own commanders. His administration was failing to plan for the collapse of the Afghan security forces. We learned that today, too. Secretary Austin said, we just didn't plan for a scenario of Afghan security forces collapse. We didn't plan for it. Why didn't they plan for it? I mean, why isn't somebody being held accountable for it? The Special Inspector General for Afghanistan has been warning for years that the Afghan security forces were not ready, that they were not well equipped, that they were not well trained, that they would not likely stand on their own. We know that the commander on the ground shared the same assessment, and yet the administration did not plan for the, by their own admission, did not plan for the collapse of the Afghan security forces or the collapse of the Afghan government, which also meant that they did not order the evacuation of American civilians in time. They dilly-dallied, they waited, they dithered. They did not order the evacuation in time. They waited until the middle of August to undertake an evacuation of civilians in earnest after American troops had withdrawn from the country. No wonder there was chaos in Kabul. No wonder that it was a total disaster. That's the administration's fault. They waited because they hadn't planned. They waited because apparently they were fighting among themselves, the State Department, the Defense Department, and the White House, all fighting because President Biden wasn't leading. It's a total debacle. It's total chaos. Now, my friend the senator from New Jersey quite reasonably wants to know, what's the connection? Why am I objecting to these nominees? Why do I want to vote? Here's the connection. It's about accountability. No one has been held accountable. I know the senator wants to hear from Secretary Austin and his committee. He should hear from the Secretary and his committee, because what we learned today contradicts quite a lot of the testimony that the Secretary of State gave to the senator from New Jersey in his committee earlier. Quite a lot of contradictions. So he's quite right to want to hear from Secretary Austin. But we need to do more than hear from him. We need to have accountability for what has happened. So until we get that accountability, until someone is held responsible, until there is some turn, some change, some shift in policy, and I've called for the resignations of General Milley, Secretary Austin, Secretary Blinken, and the National Security Advisor, all of whom planned and executed this operation. Until there is accountability, I think the least the Senate can do is actually vote. Take at least a vote on this floor for nominees to leadership positions in the State Department and the Department of Defense. So, Mr. President, I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from New